Hello, my name is Megan Romice and I'm the IS Partner Success Manager with Ingram Micro. Today I'll be reviewing your transition from an Azure CSP subscription to an Azure NCE subscription. Microsoft has introduced a new Azure offer in the Cloud Solution Provider program known as the Azure Plan. This new commerce experience, or NCE, creates a simplified purchase experience by enabling the creation of multiple Azure subscriptions within an Azure plan. NCE delivers benefits such as calendar month billing, cost management tools such as Azure Cost Management Tool, enabling partners to manage their customers more efficiently by leveraging capabilities such as the Azure Lighthouse, and better alignment across channels, now using a single price list in USD, helping customers have consistent pricing on a global scale. So what does this all mean? Each customer tenant that has Azure NCE will start with an Azure plan as the billing container for all their Azure subscriptions. They can have multiple Azure subscriptions that are tied to one Azure plan. Microsoft is beginning to phase out the prior Azure offer with the new Azure plan and NCE starting in July of 2021. You'll want to start transitioning your customers from Azure CSP subscriptions over to Azure NCE subscriptions.
So what does this Azure NCE transition look like? Well, first, you'll fill out the transfer request form. You should be able to find all of this information within the Ingram Cloud Marketplace. When you're completing each question, make sure that the naming and IDs listed are exactly as how they appear in your reseller control panel. When listing the end customer domain, put their default domain that would be listed within Partner Center. You'll be required to fill out this form for each Azure CSP subscription the customer has. For example, if the customer has 3 Azure CSP subscriptions, you'll need to fill out this form 3 times.
Next, our operations team will receive the request and transition the Azure CSP subscriptions into an Azure plan through Microsoft Partner Center. Keep in mind that when you transition, all the Azure CSP subscriptions within that customer tenant must transition. It's an all or nothing approach. Once the customer transitions to NCE, there's no turning back. They don't have an option to switch back to Azure CSP. The second step in this transition process is getting the Azure NCE subscriptions back into the Ingram Cloud Marketplace. Once they're imported, you may find that you have an Azure CSP tile and an Azure NCE tile. While the Azure CSP tiles are only a shell and contain just the old usage files. You do have the option to delete these tiles by following the process of how to cancel an Azure CSP subscription. When you transition to Azure NCE, an Azure Plan ID will be generated. You'll now have one Azure Plan ID and one Azure NCE subscription for each one Azure CSP subscription there was. For example, if you have a customer that has 3 Azure CSP subscriptions and you transition them to Azure NCE, you'll have one Azure Plan ID and 3 Azure NCE subscriptions that are tied to that one Azure Plan ID. If the customer decides down the road to create another Azure NCE subscription, that subscription will also be tied to the same Azure Plan ID as the other 3. And lastly, when transitioning from Azure CSP to Azure NCE, a new Azure NCE subscription ID will be generated. How will this Azure NCE affect your Azure invoices? Well, Azure CSP invoices, they were summarized and listed as one line item that read as total costs of Azure services. The line item contained all of the Azure native services. While with Azure NCE invoices, these are different in that each Azure service has its own line item. For example, let's say that an Azure subscription has 4 active Azure services: virtual machines, backup, networking, and storage. So on both the customer and reseller invoices, you'll find that this Azure subscription will have 4 line entries. Each line will have the total cost of each individual Azure service. Right after your transition, you may find that the Azure invoices seem a little wonky. So how do you make sense of this? When a customer transitions, they'll most likely have some split billing. Each Azure CSP subscription has its own billing period, while Azure NCE subscriptions all have calendar month billing periods. The customer will have one final CSP invoice and then an NCE invoice picking up from the day of transition till the end of the month.
Let's look at an example. A customer has one Azure CSP subscription that has a billing period of the 15th to the 15th. They transition to an Azure NCE subscription on April 10th. The customer will still receive an Azure CSP invoice with a billing period of March 15th to April 15th. The customer will also receive an Azure NCE invoice with a billing period of April 1st to April 30th. The invoiced amounts during the CSP billing period should only reflect from March 15th to April 10th. The invoiced amounts during the NCE billing period should only reflect from April 10th to April 30th. Between these two invoices, the CSP invoicing completes with the last billing period before the transition, with the NCE invoice picking up starting during the calendar month of the transition.
So when's the right time in the month to transition? Well, it depends. You'll more than likely have some type of split billing between your last Azure CSP invoice and your first Azure NCE invoice. You can try and time it so that you transition towards the end of your Azure CSP billing period, and this will mean that you'll have a full Azure CSP invoice and a smaller Azure NCE invoice. Alternatively, you can try and time the transition towards the first of the month. This will mean that you'll have a larger Azure NCE invoice and possibly a smaller CSP invoice, depending on when the Azure CSP billing period is. My recommendation would be not to try and time the invoices and the transition, as it may not really matter anyways, because you're going to end up with split billing regardless. To monitor your invoices, to ensure you're not missing a beat, I recommend pulling a billing data export. You can create a one-time report to see which customer invoices are appearing on which of your reseller invoices. I personally like to create a pivot table from these reports to show only the data that's relevant and important to me. Let's look at this example. Should you have any questions or concerns, you can always reach our Ingram Micro Cloud Support Team for assistance with your Azure CSP to NCE transition through chat, email, or phone. And make sure to check out our Azure section within the knowledge base for helpful articles and videos. Thanks for listening, and don't forget, you can always reach out to our IS team at is@ingrammicro.com. Thank you.